are familiar with the general history of the Japanese imperialism in Asia in the first half of the 20th century. We know that in the Second World War, Japan had occupied large parts of China, Southeast Asia, Singapore, and had also invaded the borders of India from the side of Burma. And the famous Battle of Imphal had taken place in 1942 as a part of that invasion. Now we know that Japan had occupied the Andaman Islands as part of their imperial quest during the Second World War, and the Andaman Islands were visited by the great freedom fighter and the organizer of the INA, Subhash Chandra Bose, also in 1943, where he had unfurled the tricolor. Dr. Sengupta has tried to capture the reasons behind the Japanese interest in the Andaman Islands, and she has also argued that for Japan, it was important to get hold of the Andaman Islands to promote their idea of the Greater East Asia Co Prosperity Sphere, which was, in a way, the Japanese argument for their own imperial expansion. And she has further argued that getting the Indian nationalist support was very, very important for Japan in order to legitimize their occupation of the Andaman Islands. So, with these few words as introduction, may I now invite Suparna Sengupta to make her presentation. Suparna, you are most welcome, and I welcome all other participants also. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I would like to thank Mr. Shakti Sinha for having provided me the opportunity to research on Andaman Islands, which was also the topic for my PhD thesis. And it is because of this 2 year period that I received to look at my thesis and to extend it further to the period of the Japanese occupation of Andamans, that I've been able to revise many of my arguments and also reiterate what was my thesis, which was on the importance of maritime jurisdiction in the Bay of Bengal, that Andamans was so crucial for imperial powers. So, in the last presentation, I would like to remind that I had tried to introduce the idea as to how convict colonization was essential to exert maritime jurisdiction in the Bay of Bengal. And it is in relation to this notion of maritime jurisdiction, once again, that Japanese were importantly looking at Andamans to not only to build the as has been introduced to the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, but excuse me, but also the maritime jurisdiction. So to begin with, I would like to make a slide show of the PowerPoint presentation. Give me a minute in here. Yeah. So, as part of my argument, I would like to read the abstract that this paper looks into the broad historical context through a longitudinal approach, which is that of the Annals school, and through expansion of the social spatial scale to trace Japanese interest in a group of islands, the Andamans and marginally Nicobars, during the period of the Second World War. So what I tried to do, which is in continuation of my earlier presentation, is not to look into Japan and not to look into Andaman in our as isolated sphere, but to integrate Andamans and Nicobars within the framework of empire building. So my two-prayer project concentrates on the issue of maritime jurisdiction, which I briefly investigate in this paper as an attendant question to understand Japanese occupation of Andamans. I argue that Japanese imperial interest in Andamans was entailed by her desire to consolidate her position as the vanguard for a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere during the time of the Second World War. Also, I argue that the sphere of influence as an imperialistic interest, here that of Japan, tied to the question of liberty or liberation of the Southeast Asian countries from the yoke of British and other imperialist powers, could not have been successful without the mediating power of Indian nationalism championed by Subhas Chandra Bose. Before I go on to explaining the sections of my
सॉरी
paper,
सॉरी मैम, ये फुल स्क्रीन पे कर दीजिए पीपीटी आप।
full screen?
या
Okay, okay. Yeah, so before I go into the sections which I have listed out in this slide, I would like to show that I had developed a framework which is that of which through the global historical method of mapping the region which is known as Southeast Asia. My study concentrates on the aspect of maritime jurisdiction and the interregional arena of the Indian Ocean. However, as Rila Mukherjee had pointed out in her Pelagic Passageways, the overland routes of the subunit of the Northern Bay of Bengal were equally important in the commercial transactions before colonialism, and I would like to add in the course of my presentation, even during the high noon of British imperialism and thereafter. I would like to show a map of this region, which is sourced from the Imperial Shipping Committee's record, which shows very clearly how in a triangular form this triangular form that the maritime interest of Japan lay. This can be seen as like how through the from the Suez Canal to the Indian subcontinent, the shipping routes were connected through Southeast Asia, as well as Rila Mukherjee had pointed out, the northern Bay of Bengal, which were the overland routes were equally important in the maritime history. For example, Japan's right to Manchuria remained an important problem which defied resolution and became part of political negotiations when it came to buttressing her power as an imperial nation. And Japan came into alliance with British imperialist power as well as went against it and thrived as a problem for diplomatic negotiations to continue. As I go to other slides, I would like to uh, remind the audience that the Southeast Asia as a terminology was basically funded by the American Area Studies Adventure, which imposed an artificial fixity to structures and connections which are otherwise fluid and dynamic. It is during the period of World War, Second World War especially, that the geopolitical term Southeast Asia was particularly deployed to loosely describe a theater of political activity. Scholars thereafter have used the term in multiple ways, but have generally included the countries in the east of South Asia, which is that of the Indian subcontinent and present day Sri Lanka and other countries, to include that of the peninsular Southeast Asia and the archipelagic Southeast Asia, which comprises of countries like Borneo and Indonesia. And Burma being close to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands was emphasized as well in my last presentation of being equally important in exercising an influence over the group of islands. Andaman and Nicobar were claimed as territories of the Indian nation state during partition and are constituent parts of the present Indian Union. Using thereby the methodology of a global historical lens, an attempt is made in this presentation to undo the superimposed structure of mapping, to unlearn the false coordinates, and construct anew a framework which improves our understanding of the region. So, as I go along with the presentation, I have drawn upon several frameworks of various scholars. Here which includes names of Van Schandel, who had introduced this beautiful concept of cartographic surgery, which kind of confines our studies to certain areas and territories of the nation states. Then I have looked into the subunit of North Bay of Bengal as introduced by Rila Mukherjee, where in the conclusion to her study of the edited volume of pelagic passageways, she had argued that and, and that other than the Bay of Bengal, thinking of it only as a southeastern delta, we need to look into how India and China had actually been two separate or two variables which have exercised influence in this region of the Bay of Bengal. And she talks about in her study before colonialism, but here I include even British imperialism, how through Indian empire and that of China, especially through the opium trade via Yunnan, had been a very important influence in this particular region. Also had drawn the framework of Carl Smith's Land and Sea to kind of explicate that water or the sea constitutes an important element of the Leviathan. So the spatial alignment of the Southeast Asia includes South Asia as we know as today, then the East Asia, and together forms this component called the Southeast Asia. I would like to again begin with the episodes of the administrative protocols of removing Japanese subjects from Andamans at the onset of the Second World War and the caution against sea fishing in the Andaman waters. Both of these precautionary measures were signs of the fading power of British imperialism against the Japanese, who were slowly making incursions on what was taken as the British sphere of influence, as well as those domains under the influence of the French and the Dutch. The precarious position of those local born in Andamans with convict lineage has been beautifully represented in the fiction The Miraculous True History of Nomi Ali, recently published and authored by Uzma Aslam Khan. The period of the Second World War has been portrayed very well in the historical fiction of Anuradha Roy's All the Lives We Never Lived. The Netherlands Indies in the letter has been portrayed as a link to the Indic civilization, which valued the good and beautiful as encapsulated by the poet Rabindranath Tagore, who cautioned against the inwardness of nationalism of the European types which bred hatred. Japan in trying to mimic the West without necessarily carrying the ills of Western civilization as a cheap imitation under the tenet of modernization without westernization, imploded with Nagasaki and Hiroshima, bringing an end to the war which was germane to the modern capitalist imperialism of the 20th century. Now, to go to the various sections, I would like to begin with Japan as a rising power, modernization and trade from 19th century to the period of the Second World War. Japan was integrally connected to the trading commercial network encompassing the Indian subcontinent and in connection with other European maritime powers, along with the Chinese Empire, before the emergence of Britain as the supreme maritime power in the Indian Ocean by the 19th century. As the historian Om Prakash had observed with regard to the commercial network of the Dutch East India Company, Japanese silver was an important constituent of this trading complex. With the gradual consolidation of Britain's power in the Indian Ocean through the violence of gunboats and diplomacy, Japan briefly treaded upon the path of isolationism, the policy of sakuku, instigated largely by missionary activities of Jesuits in the islands, and maintained an exclusive trade with the Dutch. However, the fusion of mercantile missionary activity in the various domains of the feudal lords in Japan was limited, and Nagasaki in the 19th century emerged as an important emporium, as a port city and a node in the imperial web, which briefly thrived as a Jesuit protectorate. In the words of the historian Beluvir Amara, Nagasaki witnessed the prosperity of native merchants from the city of Hakata and emerged as a fort and open port, a Chinese bridgehead in its early years, and an important entrepot. From the 19th century, there were several events which shaped the future of Japan as a rising imperial power in the East. As an Asiatic power, it is held by many historians that Japan, by early 20th century, was able to modernize itself through industrialization post Meiji Restoration without necessarily mimicking the West. Her strength as a sea power was given a boost during this period by constructing and building a navy. Here, I would like to point out some of the important events in the Japanese era. So, with Meiji Restoration, there was a construction of strong navy, and post Meiji Restoration, there were also world events like the opening of Suez Canal in 1869, and then there was the Sino-Japanese War, which kind of erupted the tensions between Japan and China. Then in 1914, we have the building of the Panama Canal with the opening up of it, which in kind of made an important intervention in this all in this first world route in through the Western Pacific. Then we have the First World War. There were also other events in the shipping interest of Japan, which is that of the creation of the modern mercantile marine, then the creation of a separate Navy General Staff in 1888. 1893, we have the Navy General Staff becoming formally independent of the Navy industry. Then in 1902, we Japan formed an alliance with Britain, which was the leading imperial and naval power then the Japanese interest for strengthened navy was partly stipulated by their interest to secure command of the Western Pacific, to secure oil as a resource, because we here see the interest of shipping also depending on the fuel for carrying on the vessels running for the navigations. So we have a shift in interest from that of flowing by the wind in sail ships to that of coal as the steam engines come, and then the mercantile marine depending upon oil. So we have the Japanese interest looking into commandeering over the South Seas, especially with an eye to get oil as a resource. Then Japan also withdrew from the London Naval Conference and organized much of the private business organizations to promote investment in the South Seas. It is with all of these developments marching out that we have Japan signing on an anti-Comintern pact with Nazi Germany in 1937. And I would also like to explicate the opium connection, which was also there, which I briefly mentioned over Yunnan, where Japan was emerging as a problem because of the smuggling of opium, which was otherwise routed to the United Kingdom. Japan also intermittently sent fishing crafts to Andaman waters, which became a problem at the onset of the Second World War. I would also now like to show some maps which illustrate the shipping routes which were important in the world arena. Here it is like the first map shows the shipping routes where this is the Suez shipping route, and then you have the various shipping routes coming across to the various ports in the Coromandel coast, the Visakhapatnam, Madras, Ceylon as it was Sri Lanka was called then to Burma, Rangoon, and here we have this group of islands, the Andamans and Nicobars, which is hardly paid attention to, but being a very important constituent block of these shipping routes. Again, in this other map, which is that of the Malayan area, we see these various shipping routes again on below Thailand branching out to these various portions of the Philippine Islands. Then here is Japan, and then like also to Sumatra and Indonesia. So these various shipping routes pass through the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. In the Western Pacific, we have Japan here. Just a second. Japan. Then we have the Vladivostok at the end of Russia, which was again connected to these shipping routes, making Japan an independent shipping base by the 20th century, which became an eyesore to the British imperialist power. So it is to go back to explicating about how Japan modernized and industrialized itself. The victory in war with China and later over Russia in 1905 proved her strength as a nation, which was seen as worthy of emulation by even the Bengal revolutionaries, and provided a fresh lease of life to Asianism, conceived in later formulation as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. To Britain, thereby, Japan appeared as a sign of potential danger and symbol of threat, as Japan's encroaching power, both politically and socio-economically, in the Indian subcontinent was a source of constant tension to them. It was not only smoldering nationalism, but also the sale of Yunnan opium and Indian opium as an excise item for supposed medical purposes to Great Britain, quantities of which were leaked and smuggled in French Indochina, the present day Vietnam, in whose politics Japan got embroiled, that further irked British administration. Japan also had an interest in shipping networks in the Indo-Pacific and Indo-Atlantic regions, which accounted for a bulk of her trade that could tilt the balance of payment with the rise in price of sterling in relation to yen in her favor in the post-depression era. Modern Japanese mercantile marine with the attendant export trade post 1894 and her ascendancy in position thereafter had a competitive edge in comparison to ships which branched out from Suez to Colombo, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Another significant development was the surge in Japanese shipping through Panama, which I've shown to the maps, to the Atlantic ports of the United States of America. Emergence of Japan as an independent shipping base, therefore, along the old established Suez route and the relatively recent Panama routes were quite disturbing to the shipping giants of the United Kingdom. The Imperial Shipping Committee, which was instituted to survey and facilitate maritime traffic and inter-imperial trade, reported increasing competition by foreign powers, especially Japan, in the year 1939. British shipping, which encompassed the Commonwealth and the Indian Empire, acknowledged an eclipse of its power in the Orient, which constituted the Middle and the Far East. The latter, in the report, comprised of India, Indochina, China, Manchuria, offset islands of Japan, the Philippines, and the Malay Archipelago. Most notably, all the British territories of the Commonwealth, except for the United Kingdom, had seafront in the Eastern Ocean, whereas five-sixths of the shipping was based in or from the United Kingdom. However, Japan's increasing presence in the Orient was seen as a perplexing issue which required careful engagement. The Imperial Shipping Committee noted with dismay in their 1939 report that the Japanese competition led to a decrease in export trade of textiles from UK to India. Also, the source success of Japanese textile competition led to an indirect diversion of carrying trade in Japanese vessels instead of British vessels. So we have this increasing competition of the Japanese against the British imperial power. So the Japanese incursion in Southeast Asia in 1941-42 sounded almost like a death knell to the British Empire. The fall of Singapore was an event which was not well appraised by the latter and as observed by the historian Nicholas Sterling, sent shock waves across the region. To prevent a similar fate, British Empire became more strident in its surveillance mechanisms, but Japan held stride for a little while, till it capitulated to the espionage on British imperial power. Its occupation of Burma and later the Andamans and Nicobars proved the failure for then of the once invincible British Empire. The latter tried to sound the bugle, and here I would like to show a poster of the British Navy, which in its rhetoric of freedom to us all tried to keep up the spirits despite the Japanese threat. Now, to come to the narrow issue of Andamans and Nicobars, just a minute. Yeah, we need to understand that Andaman and Nicobar was not just a penal colony essential to the British Empire, but it also had an economic interest. And it is important to emphasize that fishing constituted an important source of revenue to the British Empire. So, forms of leases and licenses for pearl fishing was given to the syndicate of Mr. Stewart, not only in Burma but also in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Also, measures were made to later, given that there was exploitation of seashell fishing as a revenue and licenses were given even to Japanese, that measures at the onset of the war to control she fishing in the waters surrounding the Andaman and Nicobar Islands were taken by the British. Then there was administrative and bureaucratic measures in how to kind of remove Japanese subjects from the Andaman Islands as the war became a prospect. Then there were allegations of poaching by Japanese in the waters of Andaman and Nicobar Islands. The Legislative Assembly, which was expanded, through the Montague-Chelmsford reforms, also had representatives who questioned about the illegal sea fishing in the Andaman waters, and even certain merchant representatives raised the prospect of self-fishing industry which should be given to Indians rather than the licenses being issued to the Japanese. Then, with the onset of the war, there were cries for removal of convicts or the prisoners from Andamans, given the hostilities with Japan and a prospective raid on the islands. There were also fears of the British administrators that Indian convicts could be used by Japanese for espionage as well. Now, to come to the prospect of the port issue and that of the sea customs, which is not to be seen only as an economistic issue, but also political economic, is that there was as early as 1877 the extension of the Indian Ports Act to Andamans, and even an Australian expert was employed from the Department of Revenue and Agriculture on how to exploit Andamans as a possible resource. And in 1936, in that year, port clearances were also given to places which were not notified as ports under the Sea Customs Act. With the war coming, then in 1940, there were issues as to how the Japanese consular office was to be treated. Then, there was also detention by the tension aroused by the patrolling of the German cruiser Emden and its visits to Port Blair and Cochin in 1931. Then instructions duly given to port officers by the colonial administrators on how the neutral and enemy merchant ships were to be treated in times of war. As earlier mentioned, Indian convicts were listed from Andamans, and precautionary measures were declared to kind of stop the convicts acting as spies by the Japanese in 1942. Now, 1942, as we know, was an important year in the Indian nationalist movement. And now I come to the section of INA and Japanese occupation. There has been a good amount of historiography on this period of Andamans, as already had been introduced. Then it was also the INA and Subhash Chandra Bose who played an important role in the occupation of Andamans and seeing it as a strategy for the liberation of India from the British power. But as in the recent biography of Sugata Bose on his grand uncle Subhash Chandra Bose, he had tried to demonstrate how it was a tactical alliance and the Japan and alliance with Japan was a resort taken only after the capricious decisions made by Nazi Germany. So Claire Anderson also had tried to clarify as to how are we to see the local born freedom fighters uh, who were not just acting as spies or cannot be presumed to act as spies for Japan, but were trying to negotiate a space for themselves and were in fact allying with the nationalist movement when there was a reign of terror unleashed by the rear admiral of Japanese Navy Ishikawa as when as and when Andamans was taken to be a naval base. So the year 1942 was a period when Gandhi had also declared the Quit India movement, which was not to be narrowly based on the on the basis of non-violence. And we also see that Japan's kind of support was also making the communist actors in the nationalist movement under British surveillance. However, with all the advances made by Japan, and Nicholas Sterling in Sudden Rampage has listed out how the Japanese were somewhere forced to retreat by a secret war, which was that of espionage and intercepting the messages from the broadcast made by Japanese stations during the course of the war. And Japanese were also dispossessed of their army. And with the end of the war and the tragedy of Nagasaki, Hiroshima, there were also efforts to build and reconstruct Andaman and Nicobar Islands in 1944. But by the time Japan was defeated, the British imperial power was also uh, forced to retreat. And in conclusion, I would like to say that the British imperial power, despite reasserting its right to Andamans with the end of the Second World War, it was rather a Pyrrhic victory. The British Empire were counting its days to retreat from the Indian Empire, war worried and in the midst of protests, which shook its already sapped strength. In the post-partition era, Andamans was integrated into the Indian nation state despite rival claims given its history and symbolism of fighting for national freedom. This paper, however, goes beyond the symbolic locus of the cylinder J.
Are you through, Suparna?
Yes, I am. I'm true.
Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. We are now open to questions.
Excuse me, how am I to go back to the screen? I should close this?
Suvash,
या
please help out.
यस यस मैम आपने क्लोज कर दिया है, ठीक है। आप दोबारा
Okay,
से
all right.
या
Are there any questions? All right. I think there are no questions. So
Okay.
we come to the end of this talk. Thank you very much, Suparna.
Yeah.
And uh, we will have our next talk on Rajneesh. Can you tell me what is the next talk on? Maybe we have not yet decided, but most
Yeah.
likely we will have our next presentation on in the coming week on Friday. We'll inform
Oh,
everyone.
okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.